Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 6, 2023. I'm going to be discussing today how the arrogance has led to the delusions that the aura of power of the Western establishment is adequate to sustain stability in the world. What we're seeing is huge cracks appearing in that aura of invincibility. The idea that you can impose a rules-based order to sustain an empire based on fictitious values and narratives, it's collapsing, it's going down in flames. And we can see this if just look at the tour that's being taken by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, where he's being treated to lectures from countries he's coming to, from King Abdullah of Jordan, who's ordinarily an ally of the United States. Abdullah just criticized him strongly for his refusal to allow a ceasefire to occur. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, similarly. He's maybe afraid of what he's going to get in treatment in Turkey. The Egyptians are unwilling to accept the U.S. policy. We saw the vote in the UN General Assembly, 120 to 14, calling for a ceasefire. Now, Blinken is telling the people he's meeting with that the U.S. wishes to have protection of the Palestinian civilians, a humanitarian approach, but without a ceasefire, and more importantly, pouring in more weapons and announcing complete support for the Netanyahu regime, shows the hypocrisy of that stand. You look at the deaths of women and children occurring in Gaza and the lack of remorse coming from the Netanyahu and his supporters over these deaths, talking about them as collateral damage or as they're not innocents. How is it that one mourns the deaths of Israeli babies but not Palestinian babies? This is where the hypocrisy is exposed as a fraud in his insistence that there will be no ceasefire. Do he and those in the West who are backing Netanyahu not know that Netanyahu has repeatedly called for the expulsion of Palestinians from their territory, that he bragged that he was personally responsible for the sabotage of the Oslo Accord, that Netanyahu admitted that he funded Hamas to enhance a split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to prevent against the emergence of a Palestinian state? Of course people know that, and increasingly the story is getting out. Even Foreign Policy magazine, which is a loyal lapdog publication of the war hawks and backers of geopolitics, had a story this week on how the Global South views the U.S. policy as hypocritical. For example, the double standard of supporting Ukraine against Russia, supposedly for its invasion of Ukraine as a violation of international law, but its support of Israel for its attacks on Palestine. This is definitely a double standard, and it's not fooling anyone. Now, for those who say that opposing Netanyahu and his policies represent anti-Semitism or support for Hamas, forget it. That's an excuse, a justification for shutting down dialogue. If you think that's anti-Semitic, ask yourself, why are so many Israelis who are Jewish and presumably not anti-Semites in the streets protesting what Netanyahu is doing? Why are groups in the United States that are largely Jewish, like the Voices for Peace, why are they demanding a ceasefire? So the argument that it's anti-Semitism that's leading to the opposition to Israel is another one of the fraudulent justifications for the assertion of imperial power, the idea that the aura of power must be demonstrated to keep peace in the world. Now, China is now moving in as the president of the UN Security Council for the month of November. The Chinese government has issued a very strong call for an international peace conference on the Middle East. And one should realize that China has played an important role in stabilizing the situation in the Middle East. For example, their role in achieving a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the potential for more opposition in international institutions is there. The question is, will the populations of the Western countries rebel against the fraudulent, hypocritical leadership that they have? Now, it's clear that calls for peace alone are not adequate. Economic cooperation is the key. And I'll just read you a quote from Lyndon LaRouche in 1986 on this. He said, "Durable agreements on peace and mutual security are critical for economic development. Without cooperation in economic development, political agreements lack the durability to survive," unquote. That was the idea behind his Oasis Plan, that Israel and the Palestinians, along with their Arab neighbors, engage in cooperation on major water projects to resolve the problem of scarcity of water resources, but more importantly, on electricity production, on transportation corridors, on a whole variety of activities, including industrial development within Palestine, as the basis for mutual benefit, which in turn allows the cultural potential for a recognition that the other is human also and deserving of security and prosperity. That's the basis of a durable peace. And this was the basis of the agreement reached between Israeli Prime Minister Rabin and Palestinian Authority leader Yasser Arafat, which was consolidated in the Oslo Accord, which Netanyahu was involved in sabotaging. Now, just quickly to take a look at the other disaster of U.S. policy, Ukraine. Time magazine has a major cover story on the isolation of Zelensky. And it essentially is a case of where Zelensky, who was the Time magazine Man of the Year not that long ago, is now portrayed as a lonely figure dominated by delusion, even with quotes from his own cabinet and officials, advisors saying that he has a delusion that more of the same will somehow drive the Russians out. There are reports that Biden and NATO leaders are looking for a way out of Ukraine. And it's not just about a shift toward concern with the Middle East, but the collapse of the intention to weaken and undermine Russia, which hasn't worked. Russia is not isolated. The U.S. is the country, and NATO countries are the ones that are suffering from isolation. And there's a growing recognition, even in the lunkheads in the Congress, that the United States cannot afford to be in a state of permanent war. The political effect is the collapse of Biden. His support fell by over 10% among Democrats in the last 2 weeks. And the New York Times reported on a New York Times Siena College poll, which shows Trump leading Biden in 5 of the 6 battleground states, those being Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, by 4 to 11%. And this caused even a fraud like David Axelrod, the man who ran Obama's campaigns, to say this new poll shows tremors of doubt emerging within the Democratic Party. Now, the point is, there's no solutions from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. There's a complete unawareness, or perhaps I should say a commitment to protecting the unipolar order and the benefits that the parties receive from that imperial policy. But that imperial policy is collapsing. The empire has no aura of power. And that's the result of commitment to permanent war and to the enslavement of the poorer countries in the world to a neo-colonial policy, which they are now breaking out of. So there's no solution in business as usual politics. Cheerleading for a Trump victory over Biden, that has no solution to it. What's the policy? Will we end this opposition to the emergence of the rest of the world in a new paradigm based on a new architecture for security and development? That's where the United States must go. So we've reached the end of the era of empire and colonialism and the emergence of a new paradigm. And I'll be linking some material at the bottom of the description page, which will give you access to the discussion process that's underway, which reflects this change. The obvious point is, don't just sit there nodding that you agree that the situation is dire and that we face worse consequences, that the leaders are corrupt and immoral and lacking vision. You have to become part of a movement with real vision for the future. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.